Before empires learned to write their names in stone, before philosophers built schools from argument and axiom, there lived a man who believed the deepest truths could not be spoken. His words would travel farther than any army, yet he spent his life in withdrawal. He wrote barely 5,000 characters, then vanished into wilderness. What he left behind became one of humanity's most translated texts, a whisper that outlasted dynasties. But to understand the sage, one must first understand the silence from which he emerged, and the chaos that made silence necessary. In the year 571 BC, the land beneath heaven was coming undone. Across the central plains of China, the Yellow River carved its ancient path through valleys thick with loess. Its waters, the color of old bronze millet fields, stretched toward distant hills, where morning mist gathered and dissolved, like the certainties of an earlier age. This was the heartland of civilization, the Middle Kingdom, where the Zhou dynasty had ruled for 5 centuries under the mandate of heaven itself. Their kings had once been the axis around which all society turned, the bridge between earth and sky, the keepers of cosmic order. But by the time spring blossoms opened in 571 BC, that order had become memory. The Zhou king still sat upon his throne in Luoyang, still wore the robes of the Son of Heaven, still performed the rituals that bound earth to the celestial powers, yet his commands reached no farther than the walls of his own palace. The great lords who had once knelt before him now ruled their own territories as independent kingdoms, acknowledging his authority only in empty ceremony. The feudal bonds that had held the realm together, those intricate webs of obligation, kinship, and ritual, were dissolving like morning fog beneath the sun. This was the late spring and autumn period, an age of slow unraveling, not dramatic collapse, but steady erosion, the old certainties fading, the ancient patterns breaking. In the east, the state of Qi controlled the wealthy coastal plains, its merchants growing prosperous on salt and trade. To the west, Qin was expanding, its armies disciplined and hungry, its methods harsh and pragmatic. In the south, Chu sprawled across the Yangtze Valley, half Chinese and half barbarian in the eyes of the northern courts. Powerful and strange, Jin dominated the central plains, fragmenting even as it expanded, great noble families within it, feuding like kingdoms within a kingdom. Between these rising powers, smaller states survived through alliance and cunning, shifting their loyalties with each season, seeking shelter in the shadow of whoever seemed strongest. The map of China had become a patchwork of ambitions, each lord watching his neighbors, each court filled with schemes and whispered strategies. But it was not merely political fragmentation that marked this age. Something deeper was breaking. The ritual system itself, the ancient framework of ceremonies and obligations that the Chinese called Lai. For centuries, Li had been more than mere formality. It had been the invisible architecture of society, the pattern that gave shape to every relationship, every moment of daily existence. When a son served his father, a minister his lord, a lord his king, that service was not simply obedience, but participation in cosmic order, an echo of the harmony that structured heaven itself. To perform the rites correctly was to align oneself with the pattern underlying all existence, to move in rhythm with the Tao that guided stars and seasons. But when the pattern breaks, what remains? In courts across the land, young nobles watched their fathers perform rituals no one quite understood anymore. The words were archaic, their meanings lost to time. The purposes had been forgotten. Bronze vessels were filled with wine and grain because they had always been filled with wine and grain. Dancers moved through patterns choreographed centuries before, because those patterns had always been performed. The ceremonies continued, but increasingly they were gestures without meaning, muscle memory preserved after the spirit had fled. And in the private chambers, questions multiplied. Why these specific movements? Why this particular sequence? What force did these ceremonies actually invoke, if any? If heaven no longer responded to ritual, had it ever? Or had the rituals themselves been the only gods, sustained by belief alone? Into this questioning world, new voices began to emerge. In village squares and noble courts, a different kind of person appeared. They wore plain robes or shabby silk. They carried nothing but perhaps a walking staff and a bundle of writings. They moved from state to state, unattached to any lord, owing allegiance to no territory. They were the wandering scholars, the masters of thought, men who had discovered that ideas themselves could be a form of power in a world where old powers were failing. Some taught that the solution was to restore the ancient ways more perfectly. If only everyone would observe the rituals with absolute precision, if only the old hierarchies could be re-established with their original purity, then harmony would return. These would later be called the Confucians, though their greatest teacher had not yet appeared. Others argued for something radically different. They proposed universal love, caring for all people equally, rather than privileging family and kinship. They advocated strict utilitarianism, measuring every action by its concrete benefit to society. These were the Mohists, and their ideas struck many as dangerous, even monstrous. The negation of the family bonds that held civilization together. Still others whispered of harsher solutions. They spoke in low voices about law, about punishment so severe that no one would dare transgress, about replacing the unreliable bonds of ritual and family with the mechanical certainty of reward and punishment. The legalists were not yet organized, but their logic was already taking shape in the minds of ambitious ministers. This was the 100 Schools period beginning, though none called it that at the time. It simply felt like confusion, like the dissolution of old certainties and the multiplication of competing voices, each claiming to know the path forward, none able to prove it. The philosophical landscape was as fragmented as the political one. Every thinker offered a different diagnosis, a different cure. Some looked backward to golden ages that might never have existed. Others looked forward to utopias that would never arrive. The air itself seemed thick with questions, and the questions bred more questions, spiraling outward like ripples on water. And into this world of fading rituals and fragmenting kingdoms, of wandering scholars and unanswered questions, a child was born in the village of Kuren. The village lay in the state of Chu in the south, where the hills rolled green and misty, where the accent was different from the northern plains, where old customs persisted that the sophisticated northerners considered half barbaric. It was a small place, unremarkable in every way that mattered to the great courts and their chronicles. Farmers worked terraced fields. Women tended mulberry trees for silkworms. Children played in the dust between houses built of tamped earth and thatch. Life followed the seasons as it always had, relatively untouched by the great dramas playing out in distant palaces. The child's family name was Li. His given name was In later centuries, he would be known by many names, Li Boyang, Li Dan, and eventually simply Laozi, the Old Master. But in the beginning, he was just a boy in a village, presumably, like other boys, eating millet porridge and learning to recognize the characters that marked the boundary stones between fields. The legends that grew around his birth are many and contradictory. each more fantastical than the last. Some claimed he was born with white hair, already ancient with wisdom. Others said his mother carried him in her womb for 81 years, 9 times 9, the most auspicious number, so that he emerged already a sage, already knowing what others would spend lifetimes seeking. Still others reported that he was born under a plum tree and took the name Li, which means plum, from that circumstance. We can set these legends aside gently, neither affirming nor denying. They tell us less about the man than about the needs of those who came after. The human hunger for miraculous origins, for signs that greatness was destined rather than earned. What seems clearer is that a child was born and that child possessed an unusual temperament. Where other children shouted and played elaborate games of war and hierarchy, this one often sat quietly, watching. Where others eagerly joined the competitions and pecking orders of youth, this one seemed naturally apart, not in rejection or loneliness, but in simple preference for observation over participation. The Chu countryside would have shaped him as landscape always shapes the observant child. The hills that rose in soft curves, covered in bamboo that clicked and whispered in the wind. The valleys where morning mist gathered thick as wool, obscuring and then revealing the world in gentle cycles of concealment and clarity. The streams that found their way downward through the easiest path, never forcing, always succeeding, carving stone through patience rather than strength. The old trees that stood through generations, bending before storms, returning always to stillness. Perhaps he watched farmers planting rice, noticed how they worked with water and soil rather than against them, how forcing produced poor yields while patience and proper timing produced abundance. Perhaps he saw fishermen on the river, observing how the best of them didn't thrash the water but moved with its current, how they succeeded through yielding rather than struggling. Perhaps he noticed how the softest things, water, wind, the tender shoot, ultimately overcame the hardest, not through confrontation, but through persistence and perfect adaptation. Perhaps, like many quiet children, he spent time alone, discovering early the sufficiency of his own company, the richness of silence, the way questions could be held like smooth stones in the hand, turned over, examined from different angles, without any urgent need for answers. The world around him was changing, though those changes might have seemed distant from village life. In the northern courts, young nobles were beginning to study with the new teachers, learning to argue and debate in ways their fathers had never imagined. The feudal bonds were weakening further year by year. The great states were growing stronger, while the Zhou king grew more irrelevant with each passing season. Somewhere to the north, perhaps already, a boy named CONFUCIUS was being born, the one who would become CONFUCIUS, who would devote his life to restoring the very ritual order that was crumbling around them all. But in Kuran village, life continued its patterns. Seeds were planted in spring, harvests were gathered in autumn, children grew, elders died, and one particular child, quiet and watchful, was developing eyes that would eventually see something others missed, that the struggle to restore order was itself producing disorder, that the multiplication of rules indicated the absence of natural virtue, that the solution might not be more complexity but radical simplicity. He could not have known, of course, what path lay ahead. None of us do when we are young. He was simply a boy in a village, living in a time of transformation, shaped by landscape and silence, carrying questions that would eventually require answers. As he grew into young manhood, his unusual disposition must have become more apparent. This was not someone who would easily fit into the normal patterns, the farming life with its endless cycle of planting and harvest. the merchant's trade with its calculations and bargaining, the soldier's discipline with its unquestioning obedience. His gift, whatever it was, seemed to be for observation and reflection, for seeing patterns that others missed, for thinking deeply about the questions others were too busy to ask. And somehow, through what connection or circumstance the records do not tell us, word of this thoughtful young man reached beyond the village walls. Perhaps a traveling official noticed him during a tax inspection and was struck by the quality of his questions. Perhaps a relative had connections at court. Perhaps his reputation for quiet wisdom simply spread the way such things do, through conversation and chance encounter, one person mentioning him to another until his name reached ears that mattered. What we know is that opportunity came. The Zhou court at Luoyang, that fading center of a fragmenting world, needed men to manage its archives, to preserve the records and ritual texts that justified its dwindling authority. It was not glamorous work. It would never lead to military glory or political power. But it was important work, requiring intelligence and education, offering access to the accumulated wisdom of centuries. For a young man from Chu, with a gift for reflection and a mind that asked questions, it must have seemed like walking into exactly the right room. A quiet position in the imperial archives, surrounded by the writings of ages, observing from a privileged position the workings of power and the playing out of history. Liu, not yet the Laozi of legend, accepted the position. He prepared for the journey north from his village, from the misty hills of Chu to the ancient capital of the Middle Kingdom. He was leaving the landscape that had shaped him, leaving the familiar rhythm of village life, leaving behind whatever family and friends he had known. He was traveling toward the center of the crumbling world, toward the heart of the broken order, toward the archives that would become his education and the seat of power that would become his disillusionment. What he would discover there, in the dusty halls lined with bamboo strips and silk scrolls, would shape everything that followed. The patterns he would notice in the rise and fall of earlier dynasties, the rituals he would see performed mechanically, their original meaning long forgotten, the ambitious men scheming to restore what might not be worth restoring. The question forming slowly in his mind like morning mist condensing into dew. What if the answer isn't to restore the old complexity, but to return to something simpler, something earlier, something closer to the nameless source from which all things emerge? But that understanding still lay ahead, waiting to be discovered in the silence of the archives and the chaos of court politics. For now, there was only the journey, the young man walking north through a changing landscape, leaving behind the green hills of Chu, following the river roads toward Luoyang, toward destiny. The road ahead stretched long and dusty, winding through a landscape of transformation. Behind him, the stable world of the village receded with each step. Before him, the unstable world of politics and philosophy waited, unknowing. And within him, slowly, patiently, the questions were forming that would eventually require him to write 81 short chapters, hand them to a gatekeeper, and disappear into the western wilderness, leaving behind only words. But the words were enough. They are still enough 26 centuries later. And their story begins here, in this world out of balance, in this time of transformation, in this quiet child who learned to watch the water and notice how it succeeds by yielding, how it nourishes by flowing to the lowest places, how it carves through stone, not by force, but by persistence and perfect softness. The story of Laozi begins in chaos, in the crumbling of old certainties, in the space where questions become more valuable than answers. It begins in a world searching desperately for a way back to balance, and discovering through one man's silence that the way forward might be the way back, the way up might be the way down, and the way to hold everything might be to grasp nothing at all. It begins with a young man walking toward Luoyang, not knowing yet that he was walking toward a wisdom that would outlast empires, that would be translated into every language, that would speak to every age, including our own. The journey was beginning. And in the dust of that road, in the rhythm of those footsteps, the Tao that cannot be named was already moving, already guiding, already present in the walking itself. The gates of Luoyang rose against the morning sky like the pillars of heaven itself. Travelers from distant provinces gathered beneath them, waiting for the watchman to pull back the great wooden doors and allow the day's commerce to begin. Among them stood a young man from the south, his possessions few, his manner unremarkable. No one marked his arrival. No chronicle recorded the day he entered the capital. Yet in the quiet of that ordinary morning, a transformation had already begun, not in the world, but in the way one person would learn to see it. Lier had arrived at the center of the crumbling empire, and the archives were waiting. The Zhou court at Luoyang was a study in dignified exhaustion. Its palaces still gleamed with the craftsmanship of earlier ages, their pillars lacquered red and black, their eaves carved with dragons and phoenixes that had watched over the dynasty for 500 years. In the courtyards, bronze vessels stood on stone pedestals, their surfaces green with the patina of centuries. Everything spoke of continuity, of permanence, of unbroken connection to the ancestors. But beneath the surface, the court was hollow. Officials moved through their duties with the precision of dancers performing movements they no longer understood. Ministers bowed to a king whose commands carried no weight beyond the palace walls. Envoys arrived from the great states bearing gifts that were really tributes to their own power, not his. The Zhou king received them with ceremony, issued decrees that would be ignored, and retreated to his private chambers where the weight of irrelevance could be set aside for an hour or two. It was into this world of beautiful futility that Lier entered, appointed to the position of keeper of the archives. Shi Guan in the formal language of the court. The title carried prestige but little power. He would not advise on military campaigns or negotiate between feuding lords. His domain was quieter, dustier, and in its own way, more vast than any territory, the accumulated memory of the dynasty itself. The archives occupied a series of low buildings on the eastern side of the palace complex, away from the throne halls and council chambers where the illusion of power was maintained. Their rooms were lined with wooden shelves that held bamboo strips tied together with silk cord, each bundle a document, a record, a fragment of history. Silk scrolls lay rolled in wooden boxes, their contents too precious or too fragile for frequent handling. Bronze inscriptions stood on pedestals, their characters cast in metal that would outlast the dynasty that commissioned them. Here were preserved the ritual texts that prescribed every ceremony, from royal sacrifice to the proper mourning, for different ranks of relatives. Here were the historical chronicles that recorded the reigns of earlier Zhou kings, when their word had been law from the Yellow River to the Yangtze. Here were the divinatory records, interpretations of oracle bones and the hexagrams of the Ching, attempts to read the patterns of heaven in the cracks of heated tortoise shells. For a young man who had grown up watching streams find their way around stones and bamboo bend before wind, these documents offered a different kind of pattern, the pattern of human ambition across time. Lier's duties were straightforward. He was to maintain the archives, organize new documents as they arrived, retrieve specific texts when officials requested them, and ensure that the silk cords didn't rot and the bamboo didn't warp in the damp seasons. It was work that required care, but not brilliance, attention, but not inspiration. For most who held the position, it was a sinecure, a comfortable post where one could serve out one's years in relative obscurity. But for Lier, it became an education unlike any other. Each document he handled was a window into the mechanics of power and its inevitable decay. The earlier chronicles spoke of Zhou kings who commanded vast territories, whose orders were obeyed without question, whose virtue was said to radiate outward like sunlight, ordering all beneath heaven. But as the records progressed forward through the centuries, the tone shifted. The territories grew smaller, the commands more tentative, the virtue more often invoked than demonstrated. He read of the reign of King Li, who had taxed the people so heavily that they rose in rebellion and drove him into exile. He read of King Yu, who had so alienated his vassals that when barbarians attacked, none came to his defense. He read of the gradual fragmentation of authority, each generation ceding a little more power to the great lords until the king became merely first among equals, then not even that. The pattern was clear. Every dynasty began with strength and virtue, with leaders who governed lightly, because their moral authority was absolute. But over time, as that authority weakened, they attempted to maintain power through force and elaborate regulation. The more rules they imposed, the more chaos spread. The more they insisted on their virtue, the more obvious its absence became. The tighter they grasped, the more slipped through their fingers. It was as if the very act of trying to hold on to power guaranteed its loss. Lier studied the ritual texts with particular attention. These documents prescribed the proper way to perform every ceremony, how to stand, where to look, what words to speak, what offerings to present. The precision was astonishing. Nothing was left to chance or individual interpretation. Every gesture had been choreographed, every phrase fixed by tradition. Yet as he observed the court ceremonies themselves, performed in the palace courtyards under the watchful eyes of officials, he noticed the gap between prescription and practice. The rituals were still performed, but mechanically, without conviction. Young nobles whispered to each other during the most solemn moments. Officials checked that their robes were properly arranged, but seemed indifferent to the cosmic significance the texts attributed to these actions. The rituals had become theatre, performances put on because they had always been put on, because stopping would be an admission that something fundamental had been lost. And this observation led Lier to a troubling question. Had the rituals ever worked? Or had they only seemed to work when people believed in them, when the belief itself created the order the rituals were meant to invoke? If heaven responded to ritual, why did it no longer respond? Or had heaven never responded at all, leaving humans to mistake their own social constructions for cosmic law? The archives also contained texts on divination, attempts to read the will of heaven through the patterns of cracks in oracle bones, or the fall of yarrow stalks that generated the hexagrams of the I Ching. Lier spent long hours studying these documents, not because he believed they revealed the future, but because he was fascinated by the underlying assumption that the universe operated according to patterns, and that those patterns could be perceived by the attentive mind. The I Ching spoke of constant transformation, of yin and yang in perpetual interplay, of how each situation contained the seeds of its opposite strength, carried within it the potential for weakness. Fullness led inevitably to emptiness. What rose must fall, what fell might rise again. This made sense to him in a way the elaborate ritual prescriptions did not. It matched what he had observed in nature, how winter contained spring, how day contained night, how every ending was also a beginning. The universe did operate according to pattern, but it was not the rigid pattern of ceremonial prescription. It was fluid, dynamic, paradoxical. Beyond the written documents, Li's position gave him access to something equally valuable: observation of power in action. The archives were visited regularly by officials seeking precedence for their policies, legitimacy for their claims, justification for their ambitions. They would request documents showing how earlier kings had handled similar situations, hoping to cloak their innovations in the authority of tradition. Li learned to recognize the signs of political maneuvering. A minister who suddenly developed an interest in historical land grants was usually preparing to seize territory. An envoy who wanted to review old treaties was looking for loopholes. A prince who studied the succession records of previous dynasties was contemplating rebellion. He saw how power operated through manipulation of perception, how those who controlled the past could shape the present, how authority was as much performance as substance. The king's weakness was obvious to everyone, yet everyone pretended otherwise, because the pretense itself provided a framework for order. Without the fiction of royal authority, what would hold the system together? During these years, Li lived simply. The position of keeper of the archives provided a modest stipend, enough for a small residence near the palace complex and daily meals. He had no family in Luoyang, no close companions among the court officials who viewed archivists as useful but unimportant functionaries. His days followed a quiet rhythm: mornings organizing documents, afternoons retrieving texts for officials, evenings studying alone by lamplight. It was during these evening hours that his philosophy began to take shape, though he did not yet think of it as philosophy. Rather, it emerged as a series of observations that seemed to connect with each other, forming a pattern as natural as the veins in a leaf. He noticed that the most effective officials were often those who did the least, who interfered minimally in the natural workings of their departments, who led by example rather than command. The ministers who issued the most orders created the most confusion. The kings who legislated most prolifically ruled most poorly. He noticed that the court's attempts to restore the Zhou's former glory only accelerated its decline. Every reform intended to strengthen central authority drove the great lords farther toward independence. Every ceremony meant to demonstrate the king's sacred mandate only emphasized how hollow that mandate had become. He noticed that the elaborate Confucian virtues being taught by some of the new wandering scholars, Ren, benevolence, Im Jiawei, righteousness, Lai, propriety, only became necessary when natural virtue had been lost. In a healthy society, people did not need to be taught benevolence. They were naturally benevolent. The very emphasis on these virtues revealed their absence. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that the solution to China's chaos was not more rules, more rituals, more moral instruction. The solution was less. Return to simplicity. Return to naturalness. Return to the unnamed source that existed before language divided the world into categories and hierarchies. During these years, Li began to develop the concept that would become central to his teaching: Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. It did not mean doing nothing, but rather acting in harmony with the natural flow of things, without force or contrivance. Like water flowing downhill, finding the easiest path without choosing or planning. Like trees growing towards sunlight without conscious effort. Like the seasons changing without command. Wu Wei was the opposite of the ambitious striving he saw everywhere in the court. The grasping for power, the manipulation and scheming, the endless attempts to force outcomes through cleverness and control. All that struggling only created more chaos, like a person thrashing in quicksand who sinks faster the harder they fight. He also began to contemplate the nature of what he called the Tao, the way, the path, the pattern underlying all existence. It was nameless, formless, present before heaven and earth came into being. It gave birth to all things, yet possessed nothing. It accomplished everything, yet took credit for nothing. To align with the Tao was to return to that original simplicity, before names and categories, before rulers and subjects, before the artificial complications humans had imposed on the natural world. These ideas were still forming, still finding their shape. He did not speak of them to others. There was no one to speak to who would understand, and besides, he was beginning to suspect that the deepest truths could not be spoken, that language itself was part of the problem, dividing and defining what was originally whole and undefined. But word of his thoughtfulness began to spread nonetheless. Officials who visited the archives noticed something different about this young archivist from Chu. He did not simply retrieve the documents they requested. He understood the deeper patterns they revealed. His few comments, offered quietly and without presumption, showed an insight that went beyond mere knowledge of facts. Some began to seek his counsel, though never formally. They would visit the archives on some pretext and then linger, asking questions that were really seeking advice. What did the historical records suggest about handling rebellious vassals? How had earlier kings managed succession disputes? What principles seemed to govern the rise and fall of dynasties? Li's answers were always brief, always understated, and always unsettling. He did not tell them what they wanted to hear. Instead, he pointed out patterns they had not noticed, asked questions they had not thought to ask, suggested that their very efforts to solve problems might be creating them. His reputation grew slowly, spreading through the quiet channels of court gossip. There was an archivist, they said, who understood the old ways, not as dead tradition, but as living wisdom. A young man who could see patterns others missed. Someone who, despite his youth and humble position, possessed a quality the Chinese called Ti, an inner power or virtue that radiated naturally, without effort or assertion. Years passed in this way. The seasons cycled through the capital as Li watched from the stillness of the archives. Outside the palace walls, the great states continued their slow-motion competition for supremacy. Qi maneuvered against Jin. Chu expanded northward. Qin grew stronger in the west, its harsh methods producing results that more traditional states could not match. The Zhou court, meanwhile, continued its slow fade into irrelevance, maintaining the forms of authority while possessing none of its substance. The king received envoys, issued proclamations, performed ceremonies. The world ignored him and carried on. And in the archives, Li continued his quiet study of how empires rose and fell, how power corrupted itself, how the struggle for order created disorder, how everything that seemed solid was actually in flux, how the only constant was transformation itself. He was becoming what he would later be called a sage, not through ambition or study, but through observation and simplicity, not by grasping wisdom, but by letting go of the illusions that prevented wisdom from being seen. The archives had taught him what no teacher could, that history moved in cycles, that human nature remained constant beneath changing forms, that the solution to most problems was to stop trying so hard to solve them, and that the deepest wisdom lay not in knowing, but in being comfortable with not knowing. As he entered his middle years, still serving quietly as keeper of the archives, still observing the workings of power from his privileged corner of obscurity. Liu had become someone people spoke of in whispers, someone whose few words carried weight precisely because they were so few. Among those who heard of him was a young man who would soon become famous himself, a scholar who believed passionately that China's salvation lay in restoring the ritual order, in teaching virtue and propriety, in looking backward to the golden age of the early Zhou dynasty. His name was CONFUCIUS, but history would know him as Confucius. And he was coming to Luoyang, seeking to learn from the old texts and perhaps from the quiet keeper who understood them so well. The meeting between these two men, one who believed in restoration, one who believed in return, one who would become the teacher of emperors, one who would become the teacher of hermits, would be remembered and debated for centuries. But that meeting still lay ahead, just beyond the next turning of the season, when the scholar from Lu would arrive asking questions about ritual and propriety, and the archivist from Chu would answer with paradoxes about water and emptiness. The archives had become both sanctuary and prison. Liu understood this paradox without bitterness. For years he had lived among the bamboo strips and silk scrolls, watching the patterns of history repeat themselves with the regularity of seasons he had served the court faithfully, retrieving documents for officials who rarely thanked him, maintaining records that fewer people consulted each year. The work was meaningful, but increasingly he felt the weight of walls around him, the stuffiness of enclosed spaces, the absence of wind. Beyond Luoyang's gates, the world continued its slow transformation. The great states grew bolder in their independence. Confucian scholars multiplied, traveling between courts offering their services as advisors and teachers. The old ritual order continued to crumble while new philosophies competed to replace it. And Liu, now in his middle years, began to feel the call of that changing world, the need to see with his own eyes what he had only read about in ancient texts. The Zhou court did not require his constant presence. The position of keeper of the archives was prestigious enough that he could request leave for travel, ostensibly to collect records from other courts or to verify historical sites mentioned in the documents. His superiors, absorbed in their own schemes and rarely visiting the archives themselves, approved these requests with barely a glance. And so Liu began to wander. His first journeys were modest, a few days' walk to nearby towns, visits to smaller courts in the surrounding territories. He travelled lightly, carrying only a bedroll, a change of clothes, and sometimes a bamboo writing kit. He asked little of those he met and offered less about himself. To the people he encountered, he was simply a minor official on some obscure bureaucratic mission, unremarkable and easily forgotten. But for Liu, these journeys were revelation. Away from the formal constraints of court, away from the dusty certainties of written records, he encountered the living world in all its messy vitality. He walked through villages where farmers had never heard of the Zhou king and wouldn't have cared if they had. He sat in marketplace tea houses, listening to merchants argue about trade routes and harvest prices. He watched craftsmen at their work, potters shaping clay, blacksmiths hammering iron, weavers threading looms, each absorbed in the rhythm of their craft, each practicing a form of wu wei without knowing the term. These ordinary people, untroubled by philosophy or politics, seemed to possess a wisdom the educated classes had lost. They worked with the grain of things rather than against it. A good farmer didn't force crops to grow. He prepared the soil, planted at the right time, and allowed nature to do what nature did. A skilled potter didn't wrestle the clay into submission. He learned its properties and worked with them. his hands responding to feedback too subtle for words. Lier began to see Wu Wei everywhere once he learned to look for it. It was there in the way water flowed around obstacles rather than battering against them, eventually wearing down the hardest stone through patient persistence. It was there in the way trees bent before strong winds, rather than resisting, surviving storms that snapped more rigid plants. It was there in the way valleys received all waters, while mountains stood alone and barren. The natural world became his teacher in ways the archives never could. He spent days walking through forests, observing how ecosystems organized themselves without central planning. No emperor commanded the trees to grow or the streams to flow. No ministry of agriculture directed the birds and insects in their cycles of pollination and dispersal. Yet everything worked. Everything fit together in a complex harmony that emerged not from control, but from each element following its own nature. He climbed mountains, not the sacred peaks where pilgrims gathered, but the ordinary hills that mark the boundaries between states. From their summits, he could see the landscape spread below, the patchwork of fields and villages, the rivers winding toward the sea, the roads connecting one small human settlement to another. From that height, the great dramas of politics seemed absurd, the ambitions of lords and kings as ephemeral as morning mist. During these wanderings, Lier encountered people from every level of society, in a way that would have been impossible within the rigid hierarchies of court. He spoke with peasants and princes, beggars and merchants, soldiers and monks. He asked them simple questions and listened carefully to their answers. What made them content? What troubled them? What did they believe about the way things worked? Most people, he discovered, wanted simple things. Enough food, shelter from the elements, freedom from arbitrary violence, the company of family and friends. The elaborate systems of virtue and duty that philosophers debated meant little to them. They lived according to an older, simpler code. Work hard, treat others fairly, honor your ancestors, accept what cannot be changed. It was the educated classes, the nobles and scholars and officials who created complications. They were the ones who built elaborate hierarchies and insisted on fine distinctions of rank. They were the ones who multiplied rules and regulations, trying to legislate what had once come naturally. They were the ones who spoke endlessly of virtue while practicing vice, who praised simplicity while pursuing luxury, who advocated humility while grasping for status. The more Lier observed, the more convinced he became that civilization itself was a form of disease, a departure from natural harmony that humans had convinced themselves was progress. The Confucian scholars he occasionally encountered spoke passionately about restoring the golden age of the early Zhou kings, when virtue and ritual had supposedly reigned supreme. But Lier, who had read the actual records from that period, knew the truth. There had never been a golden age. The early Zhou kings had been as violent and ambitious as their successors, simply more successful in their violence. The golden age, if it had ever existed, lay much further back, before writing, before cities, before the elaborate structures of civilization, back when humans lived in small groups, following the seasons, taking what they needed from nature without trying to dominate it. Back when there were no kings and subjects, no rich and poor, no elaborate ceremonies to mask the simple facts of birth, life and death. This primitivist vision was not born of nostalgia or romanticism. Lier had no illusions about the hardships of earlier ages, but he recognized that something had been lost in the process of building civilization, some vital connection to the natural way of things, and he began to conceive of the Tao, the way, as that original pattern, the unnamed source that existed before language divided the world into categories. During his travels, Liu also encountered the other schools of thought that were proliferating across China. He met mohists who preached universal love and utilitarian calculation, measuring every action by its benefit to society. Their earnestness impressed him, but their approach seemed too rigid, too willing to impose their vision of the good on others. He met early legalists who spoke of law and punishment as the only reliable basis for order. They dismissed virtue as naive, ritual as useless, human nature as fundamentally selfish. Their cynicism appalled him, though he recognized a kernel of truth in their skepticism about moral persuasion. He met hermits and mystics who had withdrawn entirely from society, living in mountain caves, practicing breathing exercises and meditation, seeking immortality or enlightenment or simply peace. Their rejection of the world made sense to him, but their isolation seemed incomplete. True wisdom, he was beginning to believe, required engagement with the world, even as one transcended it. Each of these encounters refined his own emerging philosophy. He was not like the Confucians, seeking to restore an idealized past through ritual and moral education. He was not like the mohists, trying to engineer a better society through rational planning. He was not like the legalists, reducing human relations to mechanisms of reward and punishment. And he was not like the hermits, abandoning the world entirely. His path was subtler, more paradoxical. He sought not to restore or reform or escape, but to reveal, to point toward the Tao that had always been present but forgotten, obscured by the complications humans had layered over it. The solution was not forward to some new system, but backward, to what had preceded all systems, not up through greater refinement, but down through radical simplification. These insights came to him not through logical argument, but through direct observation. He saw how a mother cared for her child without consulting texts on proper child rearing, how a bird built its nest without studying architecture, how a community resolved disputes through common sense rather than elaborate legal codes. Nature itself demonstrated Wu Wei constantly, accomplishing everything by forcing nothing, nourishing all without demanding credit, powerful through softness rather than hardness. As Liu traveled farther from Luoyang, his journeys grew longer. He spent weeks in the mountains of the West, where minority tribes lived beyond the reach of Chinese civilization. He visited the wilder regions of Chu, his home state, where old customs persisted that the northern courts considered barbaric. He followed the rivers eastward toward the sea, observing how the smallest tributary eventually joined the mighty flow. In these travels, he developed the practice of appearing ordinary. He dressed simply, spoke little, asked for nothing. Local people saw him as just another wanderer, perhaps a low-level official on some minor errand, perhaps a failed scholar, too poor to maintain his status. This anonymity pleased him. The less attention he drew, the more he could observe. The less he claimed, the more he learned. But despite his efforts at obscurity, word of his wisdom occasionally spread. A merchant whose business he had helped with an offhand comment, a village elder whose dispute he had resolved with a few questions, a minor official whose problem he had reframed in a way that revealed its solution. These people remembered him and spoke of him to others, and slowly, quietly, a reputation grew. Not of a great teacher or famous sage, but of a thoughtful man who understood things deeply and spoke of them simply. During these middle years of his life, Liu developed the central insights that would later fill the Tao Te Ching. The highest good is like water, benefiting all things without striving. flowing to the lowest places that others disdain. The soft overcomes the hard through persistence, not force. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Knowing others is intelligence. Knowing yourself is wisdom. Mastering others requires force. Mastering yourself requires strength. These were not abstract philosophical propositions, but observations about how the world actually worked, verified through his travels and his watching. They were descriptions of reality as it was, not prescriptions for how it should be. He also refined his understanding of virtue or power in the original sense, the natural potency that things possessed when they remained true to their own nature. A good ruler governed through through the moral authority that came from living simply and justly, rather than through force or clever manipulation. But such rulers were rare, growing rarer as civilization grew more complex. By the time Liu returned from his wanderings to resume his duties at the archives, he had been transformed. He was still the keeper of ancient wisdom, still the quiet official who organized bamboo strips and retrieved documents. But he now carried within him a teaching that came not from books, but from roads and rivers, not from texts, but from observation, not from the past, but from the timeless present where the Tao was always flowing. It was around this time that word reached Luoyang of a scholar from the state of Lu, who was gaining renown for his learning and his passionate advocacy of ritual and virtue. His name was CONFUCIUS, and he was planning a visit to the Zhou court to study the ancient texts and consult with those who understood them. Liu heard this news with interest and perhaps a touch of amusement. Here was coming a man who believed the solution to China's problems lay in the very rituals and hierarchies that Liu now saw as symptoms of the disease. Here was coming someone who looked backward with reverence, while Liu looked backward with understanding of why that past had failed. The meeting between them would be remembered in different ways by different traditions, but all agreed it happened. The passionate advocate of ritual and the quiet skeptic of all systems. The teacher who would found a school and the hermit who would disappear into the wilderness. The voice of civilization and the voice of something that preceded civilization. Confucius was coming to Luoyang, and in the archives, Liu waited, ready to receive him with the courtesy one offers to someone sincerely seeking truth, even if seeking in the wrong direction. The day Confucius arrived in Luoyang, the capital hummed with the energy his presence brought. Even among the jaded courtiers who had seen countless scholars come and go, this one commanded attention. He traveled with a small retinue of devoted students, young men from Lu who hung on his every word. His bearing combined confidence with deference in precisely the right proportions. Assured enough to command respect, humble enough to avoid giving offense. CONFUCIUS was in his early 30s, younger than Liu by perhaps a decade or more. He had already earned a reputation in his home state as a master of ritual and music, a scholar who could recite the ancient texts from memory and explain the proper performance of ceremonies that most people had forgotten. More than mere learning, he possessed passion, an unshakable conviction that China could be saved through education and the restoration of traditional values. He had come to Luoyang specifically to consult the archives and, if possible, to meet the keeper whose understanding of the ancient texts was said to be unmatched. For Confucius, this journey was a pilgrimage to the source, a chance to examine the original documents that recorded the golden age he hoped to restore. The meeting was arranged without ceremony. Liu received word that the scholar from Lu wished to consult certain ritual texts, and he prepared the documents as he would for any official request. When Confucius arrived at the archives, accompanied by two of his students, Liu greeted him with quiet courtesy and directed him toward the texts he sought. For the first hour, they worked in near silence. Confucius examined the bamboo strips with reverent care, occasionally asking Liu to clarify an archaic character or locate a related document. His students took notes, copying passages they found particularly significant. Liu observed them with the calm attention he brought to everything, noting the intensity of their focus, the way Confucius handled the texts as if they were sacred relics. It was during a break, as servants brought tea, that the real conversation began. Confucius spoke first, his voice carrying the measured tones of someone accustomed to teaching. Master Li, your knowledge of these texts is remarkable. I have studied the rituals my entire life, yet you seem to understand dimensions I have not considered. Tell me, in your view, what was the source of the ancient king's virtue? How did they maintain such perfect order? Liu sipped his tea slowly before responding, his words deliberate and soft. The texts praise the ancient kings, as texts written by their scribes would, but the order they maintained came not from their virtue, but from the simplicity of the age. People had not yet learned to desire what they could not have. Communities were small enough that reputation mattered more than law. The rituals arose naturally from custom, not from imposition. Confucius leaned forward, his expression intent. But surely the rituals themselves embodied cosmic principles. The 5 relationships, the proper conduct in each circumstance. These reflect the pattern of heaven itself. Or, Liu replied gently, they reflect what people of that time found useful, codified and elevated into eternal truth. The danger in treating custom as cosmic law is that customs change while we insist the laws remain eternal. A flicker of discomfort crossed Confucius's face. This was not the validation he had expected. Master Li, with respect, if we abandon the guidance of ritual, what prevents society from descending into chaos? What binds people together, if not shared understanding of proper conduct? Liu set down his teacup, his hands resting calmly in his lap. When the great Tao is forgotten, doctrines of kindness and duty appear. When harmony is lost, we hear much about filial piety and loyalty. When the state falls into chaos, we praise patriotic ministers. All these virtues are symptoms of disease, not signs of health. A truly harmonious society would not need to speak of them. The words landed between them like stones in still water, sending ripples through the careful structure of Confucius's worldview. One of the students looked scandalized, opening his mouth to protest, but Confucius raised a hand to silence him. Then what do you propose? Confucius asked, his voice tight with the effort to remain courteous. Should we simply abandon civilization, return to primitive conditions, allow might to determine right? I propose nothing, Liu said, and there was something in his tone, not mockery, but a deep sadness that made Confucius pause. Proposing is the problem, reforming, restoring, improving. All this effort creates more problems than it solves. The sage governs by emptying people's minds and filling their bellies, by weakening their ambitions and strengthening their bones. He keeps people from knowing and desiring, and those who think they know are kept from acting. By doing nothing that goes against nature, nothing is left undone. Confucius stood abruptly, pacing the length of the archive room. His students watched him with concern, unsure whether their master was about to explode in anger or depart in disgust. But when he turned back to Liu, his face showed neither. Instead, there was confusion, almost bewilderment. I cannot accept this, he said finally. I cannot believe that the solution to disorder is to do nothing. People suffer. States war against each other. The strong oppress the weak. And you suggest we simply yield, accept, do nothing. Lia's response was so quiet that Confucius had to strain to hear it. I suggest we stop doing the things that create suffering. Most of the pain in this world comes not from natural hardship, but from human interference, from ambition, from the desire to improve what does not need improvement, from the effort to control what cannot be controlled. But surely some things must be controlled. Crime must be punished. Borders must be defended. Children must be educated. And in your experience, Lia asked, does punishment reduce crime or simply teach criminals to be more careful? Do defended borders bring peace or provoke invasion? Does education make people wiser or merely more clever at justifying their desires? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. Confucius sat down again, suddenly looking tired. For several long moments, neither man spoke. In the silence, the archives seemed to breathe, the accumulated wisdom of centuries bearing witness to this collision of philosophies. Finally, Confucius spoke again, his voice softer now, less certain. What you describe sounds like wisdom, but it also sounds like surrender. How does one live according to this Tao, while still fulfilling one's duties, while still caring for family, serving one's Lord, maintaining one's integrity? For the first time in the conversation, Lia smiled, a small, gentle expression that transformed his usually austere features. By recognizing that caring for family does not require elaborate rules about filial piety, by understanding that serving one's Lord does not mean flattering his errors, by knowing that integrity is not about rigid adherence to codes, but about remaining true to one's own nature. But how does one know one's own nature? By quieting the noise of ambition and social expectation, by watching how water flows and trees grow, by observing that the universe accomplishes everything without effort, and considering whether we might learn from that example. Confucius was silent again, wrestling with ideas that challenged everything he believed. His students shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they were witnessing a teaching moment or a betrayal of their master's principles. At last, Confucius rose, signaling his students to gather the notes they had taken. He bowed to Lia with perfect formal courtesy. Master Li, you have given me much to consider. I came seeking confirmation and found only questions. Perhaps that is its own form of teaching. Lia returned the bow with equal courtesy. The questions are more valuable than the answers. Hold them lightly, and perhaps something will emerge. As Confucius prepared to leave, he paused at the doorway. Without turning back, he spoke one more time. You are like a dragon, Master Li. I understand birds, for I have seen them fly. I understand fish, for I have seen them swim. I understand beasts, for I have seen them run. But a dragon rides the winds and ascends to heaven. I cannot understand it. Whether this was meant as compliment or criticism, Lia did not say. He simply nodded, accepting the comparison without pride or concern, and watched as the scholar from Lu departed into the bright afternoon. After they left, Lia returned to his work, reorganizing the texts that had been consulted, returning bamboo strips to their proper places. To an observer, he would have seemed unchanged by the encounter, as calm and methodical as always. But something had shifted, some confirmation received or decision crystallized. He had met the man who would become China's most influential teacher, the man whose philosophy would shape emperors and bureaucrats for 2,000 years. And that meeting had shown Lia what he already suspected, that the path China was choosing, the path of ritual restoration, moral education, and elaborate social engineering, was the wrong path, or at least not the only path. There had to be an alternative recorded, a different voice preserved for those who might come later seeking something other than rules and hierarchies. Someone needed to speak for the way that preceded all ways, the virtue that needed no cultivation, the order that emerged from acceptance rather than striving. In the days that followed, Li learned that Confucius had spoken of their encounter to others. The younger man's account was respectful but puzzled, describing Li as profound but impractical, wise but unworldly. Some of Confucius's students reportedly laughed at the idea that doing nothing could accomplish anything. Others found the conversation troubling, a challenge to certainties they had taken for granted. Li, for his part, spoke of the meeting to no one. He had no students to tell, no school to propagate his views. He simply returned to his quiet life among the archives, his travels through the countryside, his observations of water and wind, and the endless patient working of nature. But the encounter had marked him nonetheless. He had seen the future in Confucius, passionate, sincere, convinced that the salvation of China lay in effort and education. And he had recognized that his own vision would always be a minority view, appealing to hermits and mystics, suspicious to those who wielded power, easily dismissed as impractical by those committed to the work of governing. Perhaps that was as it should be. The Tao that could be told was not the eternal Tao. The teaching that could be systematized was not the teaching he carried. His wisdom was not meant for those who sought to rule, but for those who sought to understand, not for building empires, but for living peacefully amid their rise and fall. Years later, Confucius would establish his school in Lu, attracting thousands of students across generations, his teachings eventually becoming the orthodox philosophy of the Chinese state. His influence would be vast, shaping everything from educational systems to civil service examinations to family structure. Li's influence would be quieter, slower, stranger, flowing underground like a hidden spring, emerging in unexpected places, sustaining a different kind of seeker. His teaching would appeal to poets and painters, to those who withdrew from public life, to anyone who suspected that the official answers were somehow missing the point. The two men would never meet again. Their paths diverged that day in the archives, heading in opposite directions, one toward the center of power, one toward the margins, one toward influence and fame, one toward obscurity and legend, one building a structure that would last millennia, one pointing toward what had existed before any structure was built. In the stillness of the archives, as Li returned to his work, he carried no bitterness about the path Confucius would take. Each man followed his nature, and that was as it should be. The world would need both voices, the one that built and the one that questioned, the one that organized and the one that dissolved, the one that spoke and the one that fell silent. The encounter was over, but its ripples would spread through Chinese thought for the next 2,500 years. The endless conversation between doing and not doing, between action and acceptance, between the Confucian and the Taoist way. And in that conversation, Li had said his piece. Now there was only the work of living it, of allowing the teaching to deepen through years of observation and practice, until the time came when he would write it down and walk away, disappearing into the west like smoke dispersing in the wind. The years that followed the meeting with Confucius brought a deepening quietness to Li's life, as if the encounter had confirmed something he had long suspected but never quite articulated. The world was choosing its path, and that path led toward greater complexity, more elaborate systems, more ambitious reforms. He could see it in the increasing stream of scholars who passed through Luoyang, each with a new theory about how to save China. He could see it in the way the great states grew stronger, while the Zhou court grew more irrelevant, its rituals increasingly hollow performances. He could see it in the way violence was becoming more organized, warfare more sophisticated, the old codes of aristocratic combat giving way to ruthless efficiency. China was not heading toward the restoration Confucius hoped for, nor toward the natural simplicity Li imagined. It was heading towards something harder and darker, the age of iron and blood that would eventually unite the warring states under the brutal efficiency of Qin. Li continued his duties at the archives, but with growing detachment. The documents he maintained seemed less like living wisdom and more like fossils, traces of extinct forms that once had vitality, but now remained only as shapes in stone. Officials still consulted the texts, but increasingly they sought not guidance, but justification, using the words of ancient kings to legitimize their own ambitions. The archives themselves were changing. New materials arrived not from careful historical compilation, but from the propaganda offices of the great states, each trying to establish their version of history as authoritative. The past was being rewritten, even as Li maintained the older records, and he understood that eventually these competing narratives would bury the simpler truths he had discovered in the oldest texts. He was growing older, approaching what the Chinese considered the age of wisdom, though he felt less wise than simply tired. Not the exhaustion of hard labor, but the weariness that comes from watching the same mistakes repeated generation after generation. From seeing truth ignored because it was inconvenient. From understanding that most people preferred comfortable illusions to uncomfortable reality. During these years, Li's travels became longer and more solitary. He no longer made excuses about collecting documents or verifying historical sites. He simply left for weeks or months at a time, and the court officials, distracted by their own intrigues, barely noticed his absence. The archives ran themselves through the routine established over decades, and the few times his presence was actually needed, a junior assistant could usually handle the matter. His wanderings took him farther west now, toward the frontiers of Chinese civilization, where the central plains gave way to mountains and plateaus, inhabited by peoples the Zhou considered barbarian. Here, the Chinese language faded into incomprehensibility, the familiar customs into foreign practices. Yet Li found a strange comfort in these liminal spaces, these edges where one world met another, and neither could claim absolute authority. He stayed in small villages where no one knew the name of the Zhou king, or cared about the philosophical debates raging in the eastern courts. He walked through mountain passes where the wind spoke in voices older than language. He sat beside streams that had carved their paths through stone, long before humans learned to write their histories. In these places, removed from the noise of civilization, he could hear more clearly the silence from which all things emerged. The teachings that had begun forming during his earlier travels now crystallized into something approaching completeness. Not a system. Systems were what he opposed. But a perspective, a way of seeing that made sense of the patterns he had observed across decades of watching and wandering. He understood now that the Tao was not something to be sought, but something to be revealed through the removal of obstacles. Like clearing mud from water, allowing it to become naturally clear. Like emptying a cup so it could be filled. Like creating space so that something could occupy it. The work was not accumulation, but subtraction. Not building up, but stripping away. He understood that virtue, te, was not something cultivated through practice, but something that remained when artificial virtues were abandoned. A tree possessed thee not by trying to be virtuous, but by being fully tree, expressing its nature without pretense or effort. Humans had lost this natural virtue by learning to perform virtue, to display it, to use it for social advantage. The way back was not forward, through greater refinement, but backward through simplification. He understood that the root of suffering was desire, but not desire itself so much as the multiplying of desires beyond natural needs. Hunger was natural, gluttony was not. The desire for shelter was natural. The desire for palaces was not. Sexual attraction was natural. The elaborate structures built around status and possession were not. Society had taken simple needs and transformed them into insatiable wants, then built entire systems to manage the conflict those wants created. He understood that government was necessary, but should be like a good cook handling a small fish. Minimal interference, gentle touch, knowing when to stop. The best ruler was one the people barely knew existed, whose work was so subtle that when achievements were accomplished, the people said, "We did it ourselves." This was the opposite of the ambitious reformers who announced every policy, claimed credit for every improvement, and left their fingerprints all over everything they touched. He understood that language itself was part of the problem. The moment you named something, you separated it from everything else, created boundaries where there were none, imposed categories on continuous flow. The Tao that could be told was not the eternal Tao, precisely because telling it, naming it, defining it, froze what was actually fluid, bounded what was actually infinite. These insights did not come as sudden revelations, but as gradual clarifications, like eyes slowly adjusting to darkness until shapes became visible that had always been there. He did not write them down during this period, did not attempt to systematize or teach them. They simply lived in him, informing his actions, shaping his responses, making him increasingly alien to the world he inhabited. Political unrest continued to accelerate across China. The great states grew more aggressive in their competition. Warfare became more frequent and more destructive. The old rules of aristocratic combat, where battles were scheduled, prisoners were treated with honor, and civilian populations were largely spared, gave way to total warfare, where cities were besieged, populations enslaved, and entire territories absorbed. The state of Qin, in particular, was adopting methods that horrified the traditional nobility. They employed commoners in their armies, based on merit rather than birth. They implemented harsh legal codes that treated everyone equally under the law, which sounds enlightened until you realize it meant equally harsh treatment for noble and peasant alike. They were building something efficient and terrible, a machine of conquest that would eventually swallow all the other states. From his position in Luoyang, Liu watched this unfold with a curious absence of distress. Not because he didn't care about human suffering, he did, but because he recognized that this was the inevitable result of the path China had chosen. You could not restore the old order through new reforms. You could not achieve harmony through increasingly complex regulation. The more frantically people tried to solve problems, the more problems they created. Qin was simply the logical endpoint of that trajectory, the ultimate expression of human will trying to impose order on chaos through force. The Zhou court itself was approaching irrelevance. The king was now little more than a ceremonial figurehead, maintaining rituals that no one believed in, issuing proclamations that no one obeyed. Even the pretense of central authority was fading. Lords who had once sent tribute now sent nothing. States that had once consulted the Zhou on important matters now made decisions independently. Liu found himself presiding over the archives of a dying institution, maintaining records that fewer people consulted each year, preserving texts whose wisdom was being actively ignored. It was like being a caretaker in a mausoleum, tending to the dead while pretending they were merely sleeping. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, a decision formed in his mind. Not a dramatic resolution, but a quiet certainty that arrived like dawn, so gradually you couldn't pinpoint the moment when darkness became light. It was time to leave, not just for another journey, another temporary escape into the countryside, but to leave permanently, to abandon his position, his responsibilities, his connection to the court and the world it represented, to simply walk away and not return. The decision did not trouble him. He had no family in Luoyang, no close friends, no attachments that would make departure difficult. His life had been one of progressive detachment, each year loosening another tie, until finally there was nothing holding him to this place but habit and a sense of duty to an institution that no longer served any real purpose. He was old now, though exactly how old the records disagree. Some traditions say he was in his 80s, others that he was merely in his 60s, but looked older due to his ascetic lifestyle. Age had turned his hair white and etched lines deep into his face. But he remained healthy, still capable of walking great distances, still clear in mind and perception. He began to prepare for departure, though the preparation was minimal. He had accumulated few possessions over the years. His needs were simple: a walking staff, a few changes of clothes, perhaps a water gourd, and a small bundle of dried food. Nothing more. There was no formal resignation, no farewell ceremony. Liu simply informed a junior official that he was leaving and would not return, that they should appoint someone else as keeper of the archives. The official, distracted by court politics, barely registered the information. The old archivist was retiring. Fine. These things happened. Someone else would be found. Liu packed his few belongings on a cool autumn morning when mist still hung in the streets of Luoyang. He looked around his small residence one last time, not with nostalgia, but with the calm acknowledgement one gives to a place that served its purpose and was now finished. The rooms were empty of meaning, just walls and floor and ceiling, ready for the next occupant. He walked through the archives one final time, running his hand along the shelves of bamboo strips and silk scrolls. Decades of his life had been spent among these documents, and they had taught him much. But they had also confirmed what he suspected, that written wisdom was always incomplete, always inadequate, always a shadow of the direct experience it attempted to capture. The real teaching could not be written, could not be preserved in archives. It lived only in the moment of realization, in the direct perception of how things actually were. Words could point toward that realization, but never contain it. And so, these texts, precious as they were also ultimately empty, fingers pointing at the moon while everyone stared at the fingers. He left the archives building without looking back, walked through the palace complex where officials hurried about their meaningless business, passed through the gates of Luoyang for the last time, and turned westward. Behind him lay everything he had known for decades: the court, the archives, the capital city, the entire structure of Chinese civilization as it existed in his time. Before him lay the unknown West, the frontier territories, the mountains that separated the civilized world from whatever lay beyond. He was leaving not in defeat or despair, but in acceptance. The world was following its path, and he was following his. There was no longer any reason to remain at the center of a civilization that was choosing complexity over simplicity, striving over acceptance control over natural flow. He had maintained his duties faithfully for decades, preserved the old texts, offered what guidance he could to those few who genuinely sought it, that work was complete. Now there was only the road ahead, the mountains to cross, and somewhere beyond them, a place where he might finally put into words what words could never quite capture. The teaching of the way that preceded all ways, the wisdom that existed before wisdom was named. The autumn sun rose higher as Li walked westward, his shadow stretching long behind him on the dusty road. With each step, the noise of the capital faded. With each lie of distance, the weight of position and duty lifted. By the time the walls of Luoyang disappeared behind a bend in the road, he was simply a man walking, carrying nothing but what was necessary, heading toward the mountains where the civilized world ended and something else began. The road west from Luoyang wound through valleys that grew progressively wilder, the cultivated fields giving way to scrubland, the neat villages becoming sparse settlements, until finally the landscape itself seemed to exhale after the constraint of civilization. Leo walked steadily, stopping each night wherever darkness found him, sometimes in a farmer's barn, sometimes beneath trees, once or twice in small wayside shrines where travelers left offerings to local spirits. He traveled alone and unburdened. Other wayfarers on the road, merchants with their caravans, officials on government business, soldiers moving between postings, passed him without interest. He was just another old man, perhaps a retired official returning to his home village, perhaps a hermit seeking a mountain retreat. Nothing about him suggested that he carried in his mind a teaching that would outlast dynasties. The journey took weeks. Li did not hurry. Hurrying was for those with appointments to keep, ambitions to fulfill, deadlines to meet. He had left all that behind. Now there was only the walking itself, the rhythm of feet on earth, the changing landscape, the play of light across the mountains that grew larger with each day's progress. As he traveled, he passed through the last outposts of Zhou authority, guard posts manned by bored soldiers who waved him through without question, tax stations where officials collected duties from merchants but ignored penniless wanderers, villages where the Zhou king's name was still mentioned in prayers but meant nothing to daily life. The frontier was not a line but a gradual fading, civilization thinning like smoke dispersing in wind. The Chinese language acquired strange accents, mixed with foreign words. The architecture changed, houses built in styles that owed nothing to Zhou tradition. The people themselves were different, some with the features of the central plains, others clearly from beyond the borders, living in the spaces between kingdoms where no single authority held sway. Leo found a strange peace in this liminal zone. Here, removed from the certainties of either civilization or wilderness, people lived more practically, less concerned with ritual correctness or social status. They adapted to their circumstances without the baggage of elaborate cultural expectations. In their flexibility, he saw Wu Wei practiced unconsciously, people yielding to necessity without calling it philosophy. After many days of walking, the mountains loomed directly ahead, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the autumn season. And at the base of these mountains, where the road narrowed to pass through a cleft in the rock, stood the guard post of Hangu Pass. It was not an impressive installation, a small fortress built of local stone, watchtowers on either side of the pass, a gate that could be closed against bandits or invading armies. A dozen soldiers were stationed there, along with the customs officials who checked travelers and collected tolls from merchant caravans. It was a quiet posting, too far from any major trade route to see heavy traffic, too remote to attract official attention. The keeper of the pass was a man named Yin Shi, though different traditions preserve different names, and some details have been lost or embellished over the centuries. What seems consistent across the accounts is that he was not an ordinary border guard, but someone with philosophical interests, possibly a scholar who had sought this remote posting, precisely because it offered time for study and contemplation, away from the noise of court life. When Lier approached the gate, Yinshi was there to receive him. The accounts differ on what happened next. Some say Yinshi recognized Lier immediately, having heard of his reputation. Others say he had a dream the previous night foretelling the arrival of a sage. Still others suggest that he simply saw something in the old man's bearing, a quality of presence, a depth of calm, that marked him as different from ordinary travelers. Whatever the recognition was based on, Yinshi did not simply wave Lier through the pass. Instead, he approached respectfully and spoke words that have echoed through history. "I see you are leaving the world behind. Before you go into the wilderness where your wisdom will be lost, would you not leave some record of your teaching? Some words for those who come after?" Lier looked at the younger man for a long moment. In most retellings of this story, he hesitates, reluctant to put into words what he believed transcended words. The Tao that could be told was not the eternal Tao. The name that could be named was not the eternal name. How could he write about what existed before language, what persisted beneath all categories and concepts? And yet, standing at this threshold between civilization and wilderness, he understood that Yinshi's request was reasonable. He had spent decades observing, contemplating, understanding patterns that others missed. To simply walk away without leaving any trace seemed wasteful, even if words could never capture the full truth. Perhaps partial truth was better than none. Perhaps pointing toward the moon, even if people stared at the finger, was better than leaving them in total darkness. Lier agreed. Yinshi offered him a small room in the guard post, simple but private, with a writing desk, lamp oil, and supplies of bamboo strips and silk. For how long Lier stayed at the pass, the traditions disagree. Some say 3 days, others 3 months. What seems clear is that he did not rush the work, did not try to systematize or organize his thoughts into a comprehensive treatise. Instead, he simply wrote what came, allowing the words to flow like water, finding its path downward, each character placed with the same naturalness he advocated in life. The writing was not an act of creation, so much as an act of allowing what was already present to take form. The text emerged in short chapters, 81 in the traditional counting, though scholars debate whether this division was original or imposed later. Each chapter was brief, often cryptic, more like poetry than philosophy, more like finger-pointing than explanation. They did not build arguments or construct proofs. They simply stated observations, posed paradoxes, suggested perspectives. The opening lines set the tone for everything that followed. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. From the start, the text acknowledged its own inadequacy. Language could not capture the Tao, yet here was language attempting it anyway. The paradox was intentional, a reminder to readers not to mistake the words for the reality they indicated, not to cling to the teaching, but to use it as a raft to cross the river, then abandon it on the far shore. The chapters that followed covered the themes Lier had contemplated across decades of observation. The highest good is like water, benefiting all things without striving, content to dwell in places others disdain. The soft overcomes the hard through persistence and patience. Emptiness is useful. The hollow in a cup, the space in a room, the hub of a wheel. What seems weak is actually strong. What seems strong is actually brittle. He wrote about government, the chapters that would later be read by emperors and anarchists with equal interest. The best ruler is one the people barely know exists. When the master governs, the people think they are free. When the work is done, they say, "We did it ourselves." Govern a great nation as you would cook a small fish. Don't overdo it. The more laws and orders are made prominent, the more thieves and robbers there will be. He wrote about virtue in terms that implicitly criticized the Confucian emphasis on cultivated morality. When the great Tao is abandoned, we hear talk of kindness and duty. When wisdom and knowledge appear, great pretense begins. When family relations are no longer harmonious, we hear praise of dutiful children. When the state falls into chaos, we celebrate loyal ministers. All these virtues arise only in their absence. He wrote about paradox, about how opposites contain each other, about how every extreme carries the seed of its opposite. Being and non-being create each other, difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. High and low depend on each other. Therefore the sage acts without action, teaches without words, produces without possessing, acts without claiming credit. He wrote about returning to the source, about how all things arise from the Tao and return to the Tao, about how human life follows the same pattern. Emerging from mystery, living briefly in the named world of distinctions, then returning to the nameless from which we came. Knowing this cycle brings acceptance. Acceptance brings patience. Patience brings power of a kind no force can match. He wrote about humility, about seeking the lowest place like water, about how valleys receive all streams while mountains stand isolated. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. Close the mouth, shut the doors, and all life lives in peace. Open the mouth, multiply activities, and nothing can help. The chapters accumulated slowly, each one complete in itself, yet connected to all the others, like stones in a stream bed, each distinct yet part of the flowing pattern. Liu did not arrange them in systematic order, did not move from premise to conclusion, did not construct the kind of logical edifice that other philosophers were building. The text could be read starting anywhere, ending anywhere. Each chapter a door into the same central insight approached from a different angle. Some chapters were direct statements. The Tao is empty, but inexhaustible, fathomless, the origin of all things. Others were instructions. Be like water, which benefits all things without striving. Still others were questions or paradoxes. Can you love people and lead them without imposing your will? Can you deal with the most vital matters by letting events take their course? Throughout the text ran a consistent critique of the civilization Liu had left behind. Not angry denunciation, but gentle observation of how human cleverness created the problems it then tried to solve. How the multiplication of desires led to competition and conflict. How the invention of property created theft. How the establishment of hierarchies required force to maintain them. How the very concepts of good and evil arose only after humans departed from natural simplicity. Yet the text was not purely negative, not simply a catalogue of what was wrong. It pointed toward an alternative, a way of being that worked with reality rather than against it. Not withdrawal from life, but full engagement without attachment. Not passivity, but action without force. Not ignorance, but knowledge held lightly, worn like loose clothing rather than rigid armor. The famous passages emerged during this writing, lines that would be quoted, debated, translated, and reinterpreted for millennia. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Those who know don't speak. Those who speak don't know. In pursuit of knowledge, every day something is added. In pursuit of the Tao, every day something is dropped. The more weapons you have, the less secure people will be. The more subsidies you give, the less self-reliant people will become. As Li wrote, Yinshi sometimes visited, bringing food and tea, sitting quietly while the old sage worked. Occasionally they spoke, and Yinshi asked questions about passages he found particularly cryptic or paradoxical. Li's answers were typically brief, often more cryptic than the original text, pointing Yinshi toward his own understanding, rather than providing definitive interpretations. The work proceeded without hurry. Some days, Li wrote only a few lines, then sat in meditation, or walked the mountain paths near the pass. Other days the characters flowed steadily, bamboo strip after bamboo strip, filled with his clear, simple calligraphy. There was no sense of forcing, no struggle to find the right words. The teaching had lived in him for so long that the writing was merely allowing it to emerge, like water seeping from rock. When the text was complete, 5,000 characters, more or less, divided into chapters about the Tao and chapters about its virtue or power, Tadi. Li set down his brush and felt a surprising lightness. He had done what Yinshi requested. He had left a record, inadequate as any record must be, pointing toward what could not be captured in words. The bamboo strips were tied together with silk cord, creating a manuscript both humble and profound, destined to become one of the most translated and interpreted texts in human history, second perhaps only to the Bible, in the number of languages into which it would eventually be rendered. Li presented the completed work to Yinshi without ceremony. The gatekeeper received it with reverent hands, understanding that he held something precious, though perhaps not fully grasping how precious he promised to preserve it, to make copies, to ensure that the teaching was not lost. Li nodded, satisfied. What happened to the text after this was no longer his concern. He had done what he could. Words had been written. Now those words would make their own way through the world, finding the readers they were meant to find, being misunderstood by some, grasped intuitively by others, debated and discussed and contemplated across the centuries. His work in the world of humans was finished. The archives had been maintained. The meeting with Confucius had occurred. The teaching had been recorded. Now there was only the final leaving, the passage through the gate into the unknown west. Yinshi asked if Li would stay longer, perhaps teach more fully, expand on what he had written, but Li declined gently. The text said what it needed to say. More words would only obscure rather than clarify. And besides, he was tired of words, tired of the world of names and categories. It was time to return to the nameless. On a morning when autumn had turned toward winter, when frost touched the mountain passes and the air carried the promise of snow, Li gathered his few possessions and prepared to depart. Yinshi accompanied him to the gate, tears in his eyes, understanding that he was witnessing something beyond the ordinary, a sage passing out of the world into legend. They bowed to each other one final time, no words necessary. Then Li turned westward and walked through the pass, his figure growing smaller as he climbed the mountain path, finally disappearing around a bend in the trail where the road entered the wilderness beyond China's frontier. Yinshi watched until there was nothing left to see, only the empty path and the mountains rising into cloud. Then he returned to the guard post, to the precious manuscript of bamboo strips, to his duty of preserving what the old sage had left behind. Li was gone, but the Tao Te Ching remained, the text that would be called the classic of the way and its power, the book that would shape Chinese thought, inspire countless artists and poets, guide emperors and hermits, and speak across cultures and centuries to anyone who sensed that the deepest truths could not be grasped but only glimpsed, not possessed but only followed, not spoken but only lived. Beyond the pass, the landscape transformed into something China no longer claimed as its own. The road, such as it was, became a narrow track winding through valleys, where the wind spoke in languages older than speech. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks disappearing into clouds that never quite dispersed. The air itself felt different, thinner, clearer, carrying the scent of pine and stone and distances that stretched toward horizons no map had named. Li walked into this wilderness as he had walked everywhere, steadily and without apparent destination. He carried nothing that would burden him, needed nothing the land could not provide. Water came from streams that ran cold and pure from mountain springs. Food came from what he could gather, or from the occasional hospitality of herders who grazed their flocks in the high meadows, people whose ancestors had never acknowledged any Chinese king. The traditions diverge here, as they must when history gives way to legend, when the documented life passes into the realm of story and speculation. No chronicle followed Li beyond Hangu Pass. No official record marked his movements. What comes after is preserved not in court histories, but in tales told by those who claim to have seen him, or who knew someone who had seen him, or who simply imagined what must have happened to a sage who walked into the unknown. Some traditions say he traveled westward for months, following ancient trade routes that connected China to the mysterious lands beyond. Through the Tarim Basin, past oases where merchants rested their caravans, across deserts where the sand sang and mirages danced on the horizon, past the great mountains that the Chinese called the Kunlun, believed to be the home of immortals, the axis of the world where heaven and earth came closest to touching. In these accounts, Li lived among mountain hermits, men and women who had withdrawn from the lowland world to seek truth in solitude and simplicity. They welcomed him not as a teacher, but as a companion, recognizing in him someone who had completed the same journey of letting go they were still undertaking. In their caves and simple shelters, they shared what little they had, spoke rarely, and spent long hours in meditation or quiet observation of the natural world. Other traditions, particularly those that arose centuries later, tell stranger tales. They say Li did not simply vanish into the wilderness, but transformed, achieving physical immortality through his perfect alignment with the Tao. In these accounts, he became one of the immortals, the Xian, beings who had transcended the ordinary limits of human existence and could live indefinitely, free from disease and decay, able to fly through clouds or become invisible at will. These stories, while clearly embellished, point towards something the tradition valued: the idea that complete mastery of the way might result in transcendence, that the sage who fully embodied the Tao might participate in its eternal nature. Whether Li literally became immortal mattered less than what the claim signified, that his teaching was not about physical life and death, but about something that persisted beyond both. Still other traditions, arising even later, made even more fantastic claims. A Buddhist text from the early centuries, AD, claimed that Li had traveled all the way to India and there became the Buddha, or taught the Buddha, or in some versions was the Buddha in a previous incarnation. This claim, transparently an attempt by Chinese Buddhists to establish their tradition's credentials in a culture that valued antiquity, was never taken seriously by scholars, but it reveals how thoroughly Li had passed into legend, how his historical existence had become a canvas on which later generations painted their own meanings. What seems most likely, piecing together the fragments that avoid the most obvious embellishment, is simpler and perhaps more fitting. Li continued westward until he found a place remote enough that the world could not follow him, perhaps a valley in the mountains where water and shelter were sufficient, perhaps a cave overlooking the plateau, perhaps simply a spot where the land itself felt like home, where the Tao seemed almost visible in the play of light and shadow, in the movement of clouds across peaks, in the absolute silence that followed snowfall. There he lived out his remaining years, however many they were. He needed little and took less. He watched the seasons turn, the snow accumulate and melt, the flowers bloom and fade. He sat in meditation or walked the mountain paths. He observed the animals, the mountain goats that seemed to defy gravity on vertical cliffs, the eagles that rode up drafts with wings unmoving, the small creatures that survived harsh winters through adaptation and patient endurance. He was alone, but not lonely. Loneliness requires desiring company. Li had reached a state where desires had become so simple, so aligned with what was naturally available, that nothing felt absent. The silence was not empty, but full, containing every sound that had ever been or would ever be. The solitude was not isolation, but connection, touching the same Tao that moved through all things. Whether he died naturally of old age, simply sitting down one day and not rising again, his breath growing shallower until it merged with the wind and stopped being distinguishable from it, or whether he lived to an extraordinary age, his body sustained by the simplicity of his existence, finally releasing back into the elements from which it was formed, or whether, as some tales insist, he never died at all but simply faded, becoming progressively less substantial until he was more spirit than matter, more presence than person, finally dispersing like morning mist beneath the sun. The uncertainty itself seems appropriate. For a man who taught that names were not eternal, that categories were artificial, that boundaries were illusions, what could be more fitting than an ending that resisted certainty? The historical Li vanished, and what remained was Laozi, the old master, a figure more symbolic than biographical, pointing always toward what transcended personality and circumstance. What is certain is that after Hangu Pass, Li ceased to be an individual and became a teaching. The man disappeared, but his words remained, and those words began their own journey through the world, traveling in directions their author could not have imagined. Yin Shi, faithful to his promise, made copies of the bamboo strips. The copies were carried eastward by travelers, by merchants who had stopped at the pass, by scholars who heard of the mysterious text and sought it out. The Tao Te Ching began to circulate quietly through the educated classes of China, passed hand to hand, copied carefully, discussed in private among those who found in its cryptic verses something the other philosophical schools were not providing. Unlike Confucius, who had founded a school and trained disciples who carried his teaching forward in an organized way, Laozi had no formal lineage. The Tao Te Ching propagated itself, finding its own readers, creating its own interpretations. Some who read it saw a political manual, advice for rulers on how to govern through minimal interference. Others saw a personal spiritual guide, instructions for inner cultivation and peaceful living. Still others saw anarchist philosophy, a radical critique of all authority and hierarchy. The text accommodated all these readings and more. Its deliberate ambiguity, its use of paradox and poetry rather than systematic argument, made it endlessly interpretable. Each generation found in it what that generation needed. Sometimes wisdom, sometimes justification, sometimes simply the comfort of words that seemed to describe the indescribable. In the mountains beyond the pass, whether Li still lived or had died, or had somehow transcended both states, the wind continued blowing through the valleys. Water continued flowing down the mountains. Snow continued falling and melting in its season. The Tao that the old sage had pointed toward continued its eternal movement, unaffected by human understanding or misunderstanding of it, present whether acknowledged or ignored, functioning whether named or nameless. The landscape itself became part of the legend. Travelers who passed through Hangu Pass claimed to feel something in the air, a presence or quality that seemed to linger from Laozi's passage. The mountains he had walked into took on a sacred character in certain traditions, becoming destinations for pilgrims seeking the same truth he had found, hoping that following his physical path might help them follow his spiritual one. Shrines were built, modest at first, just small stone markers or simple altars where travelers left offerings. Later, as Taoism developed into an organized religion, larger temples would rise, complete with priests and ceremonies and hierarchies that would have amused or saddened the old sage who had critiqued all such structures. But in those early years, the commemoration was simpler, more in keeping with the teaching, just quiet acknowledgement that someone extraordinary had passed this way, leaving something valuable behind. Stories multiplied about Laozi's final years. Some said he had settled among the mountain peoples and taught them the way, bringing wisdom to the barbarians whom the Chinese had always despised. Others claimed he had founded a hidden community of sages, all living in harmony with the Tao, preserving the pure teaching away from the corruption of civilization. Still others insisted he had journeyed even farther west, perhaps to the legendary lands where the sun set, or to mythical islands in the western sea where immortals dwelt. Each story carried its own truth, not as history, but as mythology, humanity's attempt to make meaning from mystery, to give narrative shape to what transcended narrative. The historical facts no longer mattered. What mattered was what Laozi represented, the possibility of withdrawal from a corrupted world, the choice of simplicity over complexity, the preference for being over-seeming, the wisdom of knowing without speaking. In the archives at Luoyang, which Li had tended for so many years, his absence was barely noticed. A new keeper was appointed. Life continued, documents accumulated. The officials who had occasionally consulted him had new concerns, new crises, new schemes. The court proceeded toward its eventual irrelevance, and China proceeded toward its eventual unification under Qin, just as the patterns Li had observed in the old texts suggested it would. But scattered across that fragmenting civilization were copies of his words, being read by poets and hermits, by curious officials and disillusioned nobles, by anyone who sensed that the conventional answers were not answering, that the accepted wisdom was not wise, that there must be another way of understanding the world and one's place in it. The text itself became timeless, or rather, it existed outside time, speaking as relevantly to each new generation as to the one before. The problems it addressed, human striving and its consequences, the relationship between action and acceptance, the proper way to live amid chaos, were not specific to the spring and autumn period, but eternal aspects of human existence. And so, Laozi, or the teaching that bore his name, became immortal in the only way that mattered, not through physical persistence, but through continued relevance, not through organizational structure, but through the perennial appeal of ideas that point toward truth. The man who wanted nothing, owned nothing, claimed nothing, left something that could never be taken away. A perspective, a way of seeing, a reminder that what seems most solid is actually most fluid. What seems most powerful is actually most fragile. And what seems most complex might be understood through radical simplification. Somewhere in the mountains beyond Hangu Pass, whether Lia's bones lay scattered among stones, or whether some version of him still wandered the high places, the teaching continued. Not in words, for words were always inadequate, but in the way water found its path and wind moved through valleys, in the way seeds became trees and trees returned to soil, in the endless cycling of forms that pointed toward the formless source from which all arose. The disappearance was complete. The individual had vanished, but the Tao remained, as it always had, as it always would, eternal, unchanging, beyond all categories, including existence and non-existence, empty yet inexhaustible, still yet moving, the mother of 10,000 things, the pattern underlying all patterns, the way that could not be told yet, had somehow been pointed toward by an old man who wrote 81 short chapters and walked into the wilderness, leaving behind only words and the silence beyond words. And in that silence, for those who learned to listen, the teaching continued, not as doctrine, but as presence, not as system, but as invitation, not as answer, but as question that opened onto all questions. What is the way? Where is the source? How does one return to what was never left behind? And the answer, impossible to speak, yet somehow understood by those who needed to understand it, was simply this: stop asking, stop seeking, stop trying, just be. The Tao is already here, already now, already you. You have never been separate from it. There is nowhere to go because you have never left. There is nothing to achieve because you already are what you seek. The old master was gone, but the teaching remained, as quiet and persistent as water wearing stone, as humble and powerful as the valley that receives all streams, as empty and useful as the space that makes a room. Laozi had disappeared into legend, and in disappearing had become eternal. The Han dynasty rose from the ashes of Qin's collapse in 206 BSE, and with it came a different approach to governance. Where Qin had ruled through harsh law and brutal efficiency, the Han emperors sought legitimacy through a synthesis of philosophies, drawing from Confucianism, legalism, and increasingly from the Taoist tradition that had survived in the margins. The new dynasty understood that endurance required flexibility, that pure force was brittle, and that even an empire needed spaces where different ways of thinking could breathe. Under the Han, Laozi's status began to shift from obscure sage to cultural icon. Scholars at court began to study the Tao Te Ching alongside the Confucian classics, recognizing that its insights into governance complemented rather than contradicted the emphasis on ritual and hierarchy. The idea of ruling through minimal interference appealed to practical-minded emperors who understood that micromanagement bred resentment, while a lighter touch often produced better results. By the 2nd century BC, copies of the Tao Te Ching had proliferated throughout the empire. Archaeological discoveries in the 20th century would unearth versions of the text written on silk, buried in tombs dating to this period, showing that it was already being treated as a classic worthy of preservation alongside a person's most valued possessions. These ancient manuscripts revealed variations in the text, chapters in different orders, slight differences in wording, suggesting that the teaching had circulated orally alongside the written versions, adapting naturally to different contexts. It was during the Han dynasty that Laozi himself began to be deified, transformed from historical figure to divine being. Religious Taoism, which had been developing alongside the philosophical tradition, needed a founder figure comparable to the Buddha or Confucius. Laozi fit perfectly, mysterious enough to accommodate mythologization, ancient enough to claim primordial wisdom. By the 2nd century AD, he was being worshipped as Taishang Laojun, the supreme old lord, a cosmic deity who had existed before creation itself and who periodically appeared in the world to guide humanity back to the Tao. This deification created a tension within Taoism that has never been fully resolved. The man who had taught that names were not eternal became one of the most named figures in Chinese religion. The sage who had advocated emptiness and non-action became the center of elaborate rituals. The teaching that questioned all hierarchies generated its own hierarchy of deities, priests, and initiates. Yet perhaps this paradox was itself deeply Taoist. The teaching adapting, transforming, proving flexible enough to serve many needs across many centuries. In the year 142 AD, a man named Zhang Daoling claimed to have received a revelation from the deified Laozi, who appointed him as the first celestial master and commanded him to establish a theocratic community in what is now Sichuan province Jiangdaoling, founded what would become the first organized Taoist church, complete with hierarchical priesthood, formal rituals, and a system of governance that blended spiritual and temporal authority. His descendants would continue to hold the title of Celestial Master for nearly 2,000 years, creating one of the longest continuous religious lineages in human history. The Celestial Masters sect introduced elements that Laozi himself might not have recognized: confession of sins, healing rituals, communal ceremonies, detailed regulations for both religious practice and daily life. Yet they claimed direct descent from his teaching, interpreting the Tao Te Ching as not merely philosophical wisdom, but revealed scripture. The text that had begun as 81 brief chapters of observation and paradox became the foundation for an elaborate religious system. Other Taoist sects emerged during the Han and the centuries that followed. The Ching school emphasized meditation and visualization, teaching practitioners to journey through internal heavenly realms populated by immortals and deities. The Lingbao school developed elaborate rituals for salvation and cosmic renewal, drawing influences from Buddhism that had begun entering China along the Silk Road. Each school had its own texts, its own practices, its own interpretation of what it meant to follow the Tao. This proliferation of sects and practices demonstrated both the vitality and the ambiguity of Laozi's original teaching. Because he had not established a school, appointed successors, or defined orthodoxy, anyone could claim to represent authentic Taoism. The lack of central authority that philosophical Taoists saw as a feature became, for religious Taoists, a problem requiring solution through the establishment of lineages, the compilation of approved texts, and eventually the formation of a Taoist canon that paralleled the Buddhist and Confucian canons. Buddhism's arrival in China during the 1st centuries AD profoundly influenced Taoism's development. The two traditions initially competed for imperial patronage and popular support, but increasingly they influenced each other. Buddhist translators, lacking Chinese equivalents for Sanskrit concepts, borrowed Taoist terminology, using Wu Wei to translate nirvana and comparing the Buddha nature to the Taoists. Impressed by Buddhism's sophisticated philosophy and organizational structure, began developing their own philosophical sophistication and institutional forms. The interaction produced fascinating hybrid practices and mutual enrichment. Chan Buddhism, known in Japan as Zen, emerged from this dialogue, combining Buddhist meditation with Taoist spontaneity and naturalness. Chan masters spoke of sudden enlightenment occurring through ordinary activities, echoing Zhuangzi's stories more than Indian Buddhist philosophy. They emphasized direct experience over scriptural study, pointing toward truth rather than explaining it, using paradoxical questions to short-circuit rational thought. All techniques that owed as much to Taoism as to Buddhism. Meanwhile, Taoist meditation developed in conversation with Buddhist practices. Breathing exercises that had existed in early Taoism became more systematized, mapped onto theories of internal energies flowing through channels in the body. Visualization practices became more elaborate, inner alchemy becoming as complex as the outer alchemy that sought physical immortality through elixirs. The religious Taoists developed their own monastic tradition, with abbots and monasteries modeled partly on Buddhist examples. Through all these transformations, the Tao Te Ching remained central, the common reference point for all schools of Taoism, regardless of their specific practices or interpretations. Commentaries multiplied across the centuries, each generation finding new meanings in the ancient verses. Some commentaries were philosophical, exploring the metaphysical implications of the text. Others were political, reading it as advice for rulers. Still others were mystical, treating it as a map to spiritual transcendence. The text accommodated all these readings, its deliberate ambiguity proving endlessly generative. The Tang dynasty, ruling from 618 to 907 AD, marked a golden age for Taoism. Emperor Xuanzong, who reigned in the 8th century, was particularly devoted to the tradition. He declared Taoism the official state religion, requiring all officials to study the Tao Te Ching and pass examinations on its content. He built temples throughout the empire, commissioned new commentaries, and claimed personal descent from Laozi himself, both sharing the surname Li. Under Tang patronage, Taoism flourished culturally as well as institutionally. The great poets of the age, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, infused their work with Taoist sensibilities. They wrote of mountains and rivers, of wine and wandering, of the futility of official ambition and the pleasure of simple observation. Li Bai in particular embodied the Taoist ideal of the free spirit, spending his life traveling, drinking, writing poems on tavern walls, refusing to be constrained by social convention or political responsibility. Taoist themes permeated other arts as well. Landscape painting developed as a distinctly Chinese form, artists attempting to capture not the surface appearance of nature, but the animating spirit behind it. The Tao manifesting through mountains and mist. Calligraphy became meditation. Each brush stroke an act of Wu Wei, the hand moving in spontaneous response to inner rhythm rather than conscious planning. Even martial arts began incorporating Taoist principles, emphasizing yielding over force, circular motion over linear, internal cultivation over external technique. Traditional Chinese medicine, which had been developing for centuries, crystallized during this period into systematic theory, deeply informed by Taoist ideas. The concept of qi, vital energy flowing through the body along meridian channels, derived partly from Taoist internal alchemy. The emphasis on balance between yin and yang, on treating the whole person rather than isolated symptoms, on supporting the body's natural healing capacity rather than aggressively intervening, all reflected principles found in the Tao Te Ching. Acupuncture, herbal medicine, dietary therapy, massage. These practical healing arts grew from the same root as philosophical Taoism. Careful observation of natural processes, understanding of cycles and patterns, respect for the body's inherent wisdom. A good doctor, like a good ruler in Laozi's teaching, worked with minimal intervention, subtle adjustments, knowing when to act and when to let nature take its course. Even practices like feng shui, arranging space to harmonize with natural energies, emerged from Taoist understanding of how environments affect human well-being. The idea that buildings, rooms, and even furniture placement could either support or impede the flow of qi led to sophisticated systems of geomancy that influenced architecture throughout East Asia. Emperors consulted feng shui masters when building palaces, merchants when opening shops, families when arranging homes. The influence of Laozi's teaching thus permeated Chinese culture at every level, from imperial policy to popular practice, from high philosophy to everyday customs. Taoism was not just a religion or philosophy, but a sensibility, a way of seeing and being that colored everything it touched. Even people who never read the Tao Te Ching lived in a culture shaped by its insights, accepting as common sense ideas that had once seemed paradoxical. Through subsequent dynasties, Song, Yuan, Ming, Qing, Taoism adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining continuity with its sources. Under Mongol rule in the 13th and 14th centuries, Taoism survived by accommodating the new rulers while preserving its practices in monasteries and among the common people. When the Ming dynasty restored native Chinese rule in 1368, Taoism experienced a revival, though it increasingly had to compete with Neo-Confucianism for intellectual influence and with popular Buddhism for mass appeal. The relationship between philosophical and religious Taoism remained fluid throughout these centuries. Educated literati typically approached Taoism philosophically, reading the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi as profound wisdom texts while remaining skeptical of religious claims about immortality and divine intervention. They might practice Taoist meditation or follow Taoist health regimens without believing in the religious cosmology. Meanwhile, common people typically engaged with Taoism religiously, visiting temples, consulting priests, participating in festivals, seeking blessings and healing from Taoist deities. This division was never absolute. Literati sometimes had profound religious experiences that confirmed aspects of religious Taoism. Common people sometimes grasped philosophical insights through religious practice. The two streams influenced each other continuously. Philosophical Taoism providing intellectual depth to religious practice, while religious Taoism provided experiential validation of philosophical principles. By the time the Ching dynasty fell in 1912, ending 2,000 years of imperial rule, Taoism had become so thoroughly interwoven with Chinese culture that separating them was nearly impossible. The revolutionary movements of the 20th century, whether nationalist or communist, saw traditional culture as an obstacle to modernization and attempted to suppress or reform it. Temples were closed, priests forced to return to secular life, texts confiscated or destroyed. The Cultural Revolution of the 1960s was particularly devastating, treating traditional culture as feudal superstition that must be eliminated for progress to occur. Yet Taoism survived this persecution as it had survived previous upheavals, its roots too deep to be easily torn out. In Taiwan and Hong Kong, where the revolution's reach was limited, Taoist temples and practices continued. In the West, where Chinese immigrants had carried their traditions, Taoism found new audiences. And on the mainland itself, despite official suppression, people quietly maintained practices, preserved texts, passed teachings to the next generation. The Tao Te Ching, meanwhile, had begun a different journey, out of China and into the world. Jesuit missionaries in the 16th century first encountered it and attempted translations, though their understanding was limited by cultural distance and their own theological assumptions. Serious European engagement with the text began in the 19th century, when scholars began producing translations that, while often flawed, introduced Laozi's teaching to Western audiences. The text arrived in the West at a moment of cultural crisis. Industrial revolution, urbanization, and scientific materialism had created prosperity but also alienation. Traditional religious certainties were eroding. People sought new sources of meaning, new ways to understand humanity's place in nature and cosmos. The Tao Te Ching offered radical alternatives to Western assumptions about progress, control, and the relationship between humans and nature. By the 20th century, translations of the Tao Te Ching multiplied exponentially. Each translator brought their own perspective, finding in the text confirmation of their particular interests. Some emphasized its political philosophy, reading it as anarchist or libertarian. Others focused on its mysticism, treating it as spiritual guidance comparable to Western mystical traditions. Still others approached it psychologically, seeing in its paradoxes profound insights into human consciousness. The counterculture movements of the 1960s embraced Taoism enthusiastically. Young people rejecting the materialism and conformity of mainstream society found in Laozi a voice that had been questioning similar things for 2,500 years. The emphasis on naturalness, on questioning authority, on finding one's own way, rather than following prescribed paths, all resonated deeply with the emerging youth culture. Environmental movements also drew inspiration from Taoist ideas. The teaching that humans should live in harmony with nature, rather than trying to dominate it, that interference often creates the problems we then try to solve, that less can be more. These insights seemed urgently relevant to a world facing ecological crisis. Deep ecology and other environmental philosophies found in Taoism a sophisticated articulation of principles they were discovering independently. Feminists noted that the Tao Te Ching was one of the few ancient texts to celebrate qualities traditionally coded as feminine: receptivity, softness, emptiness, yielding, as sources of strength rather than weakness. The famous passage about how the valley spirit, the feminine, never dies, because it is the source from which all things emerge, offered a powerful alternative to patriarchal hierarchies that valued dominance and control. Scientists and mathematicians discovered unexpected parallels between Taoist descriptions of reality and modern physics. The Tao Te Ching's emphasis on complementary opposites, on processes rather than things, on observer and observed being interconnected, all seem to anticipate insights from quantum mechanics and complexity theory. Books like Fritjof Capra's The Tao of Physics explored these parallels, sometimes overstating them, but nonetheless revealing genuine resonances between ancient wisdom and modern science. The text proved remarkably adaptable to different cultural contexts. In each language it was translated into, in each culture that encountered it, people found something that spoke to their particular situation. A text written in ancient Chinese for a specific historical moment turned out to contain insights that transcended that moment, addressing perennial aspects of human existence that remained constant across cultures and centuries. By the beginning of the 21st century, the Tao Te Ching had become one of the most translated texts in human history, rendered into virtually every written language, with hundreds of English translations alone. It appeared in countless editions: scholarly, popular, illustrated, adapted for children, paired with photography, Interpreted through various philosophical lenses, new commentaries continued to emerge, each finding fresh meanings in the ancient verses. In China itself, after decades of suppression, Taoism experienced a revival. Temples reopened, practices resumed. Young people began studying texts their grandparents had hidden during the Cultural Revolution. The government, having moved from suppressing traditional culture to selectively promoting it as heritage, supported this revival, seeing in Taoism an authentic Chinese tradition that could provide cultural identity in a globalizing world. Modern Taoist temples serve diverse functions. Some focus on religious practice, rituals, offerings, festivals celebrating Taoist deities. Others emphasize cultural preservation, maintaining traditional arts and practices. Still others offer services like healing, counseling, or teaching martial arts and meditation. Tourist sites preserve historic temples as monuments to China's cultural heritage, while active communities of practitioners carry on living traditions. The philosophical religious distinction persists in modern Taoism, but with less rigidity than in past centuries. Many practitioners combine elements freely, reading the Tao Te Ching philosophically while participating in religious rituals, practicing meditation while maintaining skepticism about literal immortality, appreciating the wisdom tradition while adapting it to contemporary concerns. Western practitioners of Taoism have created their own approaches, often focusing on practical applications, meditation techniques, health practices, martial arts, while remaining relatively uninterested in the religious cosmology, Tai Chi and Qigong. Internal martial arts rooted in Taoist principles of yielding and internal energy cultivation have spread globally, practiced by millions who may know nothing else about Taoism, but who embody its principles through these practices. The influence of Laozi's teaching extends far beyond those who identify as Taoist. His insights have entered the common wisdom of humanity, recognized as true even by those who have never read the source. The idea that less can be more, that the soft can overcome the hard, that emptiness is useful, that going with the flow is often wiser than struggling against it. These ideas are now global, part of how humans across cultures understand themselves and their world. In literature, countless writers have drawn inspiration from Taoist themes. Ursula K. Le Guin's novels explored Taoist philosophy through science fiction and fantasy. Beat poets like Gary Snyder brought Taoist sensibilities into American verse. Contemporary authors continue to reference the Tao Te Ching, finding in its paradoxes and parables enduring relevance to modern life. In business and management, Laozi's ideas about leadership have found practical application. The concept of the leader who leads by not leading, who empowers others rather than controlling them, who creates conditions for success rather than dictating methods. This has influenced organizational theory and practice. Books applying Taoist principles to business leadership, often with titles like The Tao of Leadership or The Tao of Management, demonstrate the adaptability of insights first articulated for rulers of ancient Chinese states. In psychology and therapy, Taoist ideas about acceptance, about working with rather than against oneself, about the value of not knowing, have influenced various approaches from Gestalt therapy to mindfulness-based practices. The emphasis on being present, on observing without judgment, on allowing rather than forcing, these therapeutic principles echo Taoist wisdom. The physical places associated with Laozi have become pilgrimage sites. The village in Henan province, claimed as his birthplace, hosts a temple and cultural center, Hangu Pass, where he supposedly wrote the Tao Te Ching, attracts visitors seeking connection with that mythic moment. These sites blend tourism with genuine devotion, historical curiosity with spiritual seeking, becoming spaces where the ancient sage's presence can still be felt, or at least imagined. 26 centuries after Liu walked away from Luoyang and disappeared into the western mountains, his teaching remains vitally present. The world he knew has vanished completely. The Zhou dynasty, the warring states, the entire civilization that formed his context. Yet his words still speak with relevance and power, still point toward truths that transcend their specific historical moment. The paradox he embodied persists. Through withdrawal, he became influential. Through silence, he became one of history's most quoted sages. Through writing what could not be written, he created a text that has outlasted empires. The man who wanted nothing created something precious. The teacher who sought no disciples inspired countless followers. The wanderer who left the world shaped it more deeply than those who tried to rule it. In the end, perhaps the greatest testament to Laozi's wisdom is how little we know about him as a person, and how much his teaching has mattered anyway. The biographical details are uncertain, the legends are embellished, the historical facts are few. But the words remain, and the words are enough. They point toward a way of being that each person must discover for themselves. A truth that cannot be transmitted but only recognized. A Tao that exists before and beyond all names. The highest good is like water, still benefiting all things without striving. The soft still overcomes the hard through patience. Valleys still receive all streams by being low. The teaching that could not be told has somehow been communicated, passed from generation to generation, translated into every language, speaking to each age in the voice it needs to hear. Somewhere in the mountains beyond Hangu Pass, the wind moves through valleys as it always has. Streams find their way downward without choosing. Trees grow toward light without conscious effort. The Tao that Laozi pointed toward continues its eternal movement, present whether recognized or ignored, functioning whether named or nameless. As alive today as it was in the 6th century BC, when an old man walked away from civilization and wrote 81 chapters before disappearing into wilderness. The story that began in a world out of balance ends in the understanding that balance was never lost, only obscured. The journey that started with a young man observing streams and bamboos in the hills of Chu concludes with the recognition that the Tao he spent his life understanding was present all along, in every moment, in every place, accessible to anyone willing to stop grasping and simply be. Laozi is gone, but the way remains, not as doctrine or system, but as invitation, not as answer, but as question, not as destination, but as path. And on that path, in every generation, travelers still walk, each finding their own way back to what was never separate, each discovering in the ancient words a mirror reflecting their own deepest knowing, each realizing that the journey of 1,000 miles, which begins with a single step, has already been completed in the stillness from which all movement arises.